Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is time once again to pretend. We're going to pretend today is July 19th. It is, of course, for you. It's not for me. July 19th, 2023. That's the date for which this show is designated. Another 1 hour special because I'm on vacation. Another great collection of stories from the archives. And another double shot of Rosalyn MacGregor because I'm tired and I didn't want to record all of it. And Rosalyn was so generous in providing us some great material. And I think I just discovered that there's still one I left out. And I'm going to have to catch up on that when we get back on the air live. I just can't sandwich another one in there. All right. Well, anyway, hey, what did I play yesterday for a rerun? It's now, for me, July 14th. And I don't know what my choice was for Tuesday's rerun. You already know. You're in the know. You're an insider. That is the privilege of being a Kagro in the Morning listener. You know what I played yesterday. I don't. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was the best rerun episode ever. And if you missed it, you're going to want to go back and listen to it because of how great it was. This, according to what I imagine people are saying right now, except for me, that's several days in the future. Okay, time for us to get right to it. Okay, we have an interesting twist to today's show. We're leading off with Rosalyn MacGregor, because I got one giant story in the middle, and I had it all set up a different way, and I realized it sounds kind of funky to have Rosalyn taking us out of the show, so I'm going to rearrange things a little bit and let Rosalyn lead off so that I can wind up the show later on. Ready? Okay. Good morning again, Rosalyn. We'll hear from you twice again, Rosalyn. Let's roll. Cart one.
Good morning, David. Today's contribution is about the consequences of abusing the 2020 and the 2022 election system in Michigan. First, there's the 2020 election. Recently, Michigan Republican Party Chair Kristina Karamo and 8 others have been sanctioned by a Wayne County judge, ordered to pay more than $58,000 over their lawsuit that alleged, without evidence, that there was widespread voter fraud in Detroit days before the November 2020 election. Quote, plaintiff's complaint was rife with speculation, an absence of facts, and a lack of understanding of Michigan election statutes and Detroit absentee ballot procedures. Unquote. Third Circuit Court Judge Timothy Kenny wrote in the order. He ruled their lawsuit had been devoid of merit and frivolous, ordering the plaintiffs in the suit and their attorneys to together pay $58,459 in attorney fees and costs to the office of Detroit City Clerk Janice Winfrey, who was named as the defendant in the lawsuit. Judge Kenny reiterated the suit contradicted the absentee voting protections included in Michigan's Constitution. Quote, plaintiffs merely threw out the allegation of corruption in Detroit as the reason for disregarding the Michigan Constitution in this state's largest city, he wrote. The order includes attorney Daniel Hartman, who has since been referred to as the GOP's in-house lawyer, and Alexandria Taylor, who recently launched a campaign for U.S. Senate. Hartman has frequently represented election conspiracy theorists in Michigan, but none of the numerous suits he's filed have been successful. In a filing trying to prevent sanctions, the attorneys said their lawsuit had been, quote, seeking truth, unquote, and attempted to rehash their arguments, arguing that procedural restrictions had prevented them from fully making their case. Judge Kenny had particular derision for their motion to disqualify every judge in the Third Circuit in one fell swoop, which he also ruled was frivolous. On a different issue that occurred in the 2022 Michigan GOP election primary comes this report of criminal consequences. 3 people are facing a total of 79 charges for their alleged involvement in a 2022 signature forgery scandal that halved the Republican gubernatorial field, according to court records filed recently. Willie Reed, Sean Wilmoth and Jamie Wilmoth each face charges including election forgery, computer fraud, conducting a criminal enterprise, and false pretenses, all felonies, according to the 37th District Court in Warren. 5 of 10 Republican gubernatorial hopefuls failed to make the August primary ballot last year after state election officials determined a large portion of their petition signatures had been faked. Former Detroit Police Chief James Craig, Oakland County businessman Perry Johnson, Byron Center businesswoman Donna Brandenburg, and Gravehaven financial advisor Michael Markey all failed in their attempts to stave off rejection at a Board of State Canvassers meeting in late May 2022. Michigan State Police Captain Mike Brown withdrew from the race before the board could rule against his petition signatures. Sean Wilmoth's company, First Choice Contracting, had been paid $219,000 in total by Brandenburg and Brown's companies. TV station WXYZ in Detroit had previously reported that Sean Wilmoth had been charged with election fraud in Virginia in 2011. Petition Reed, a Florida company registered to Willie Reed Jr., was paid nearly $51,000 by Johnson's campaign and $15,000 by Ryan Kelly's campaign. Kelly, however, emerged with enough signatures to make the primary ballot. Sean Wilmoth is also listed as an officer for a company called Signature Masters, previously registered in East Point. The elected candidates' legal challenges to the Board of State Canvassers ultimately failed. The scandal upended the gubernatorial races given the ouster of Craig and Johnson, seen as the leading candidates in the primary field, clearing the way for Tudor Dixon to ultimately win the nomination after receiving the endorsement of former President Donald Trump. Dixon later lost to Governor Gretchen Whitmer last November by roughly 11 percentage points as Democrats made sweeping statewide gains. That's my time today. This is Rosalyn MacGregor, your Michigan correspondent, signing off. Back to you, David.
Thanks again, Rosalyn. Hey, why don't you take a short break for breakfast? In fact, why don't you take an extra long break for breakfast? We're going to need you back in a little bit, but first, a rather lengthy segment. Okay, well, we've reached that point in the show where we're going to read from Amanda Marcotte again, in Salon magazine. This, an interesting and different kind of piece, also a reported piece rather than an opinion piece. Interesting title, caught my eye, of course, and didn't even have to look, well, didn't look at all at who wrote it, but, okay, you know, if it's Salon, it's like a 95% chance it is going to end up being Amanda Marcotte if we're reading it out loud. Shutting down the right-wing rabbit hole is possible. Really? Okay. First, follow the money. Schools and parents are suing social media giants over their, quote, addictive algorithms. Can that force a reckoning? It actually reminds me of a number of places where, opening up interesting and innovative claims in lawsuits, whether it's insurance and guns or whatever. These are exploiting some real powerful wedge forces in our society. All right, so let's take a look at this one here. Again, it's Amanda Marcotte. It's back from June 30th, and let's see what gets done here. Is it possible? Is it something we can push forward? Something we can participate in? Let's see. It begins this way with a quote. "The man I loved wasn't there anymore. And instead, this monster that had the most horrible thoughts about people was in its place." Yikes. Sounds kind of scary. "When the woman I'll call Anne," Amanda will call her Anne, we'll do the same, "married her husband in 2002, he was, quote, someone who couldn't care less about anything political at all. Over the years, he drifted into being a Republican, but it wasn't until 2017, after the election of, Donald Trump, when she says his radicalization and intro to conspiracy theory happened. Within the last few months, Anne told me her husband began telling their children, quote, how the people behind Monster Energy drink are obviously Satanists because they hid symbols on their can. All right, well, my sound effects are not as readily at hand here, But not only does that call for dramatic effects, but it calls for the horror dramatic, I would think. Really, anytime the Satanists come up, we should be doing this. Anyway, I met Anne on the Reddit forum QAnon Casualties, where family members and friends of QAnon believers and other far-right conspiracy theorists come to commiserate. Like several other members of the forum I contacted, she requested that Salon not publish her real name. Anne hung in there for years, sticking with her husband through the far-right conspiracy theories and the flat-out weird ones. He tried to convince me that the NFL was run exactly like the WWE and that it was all entirely scripted, she told me. Eventually, with the help of a therapist, she came to the conclusion that there is literally nothing I can say to bring him back. That realization has made things easier to handle, Anne says. Before that, all I could think about was how badly I wanted to die, she continued. I was scaring myself with how badly I just wanted out. With her therapist's aid, she says she is now planning an exit strategy from her marriage. Good, not from her life. Anne's journey is one that untold numbers of people have endured in recent years, watching a loved one become radicalized through online disinformation. Once such people have disappeared down the proverbial rabbit hole, it can sometimes be impossible to get them back. Preventing people from falling into the disinformation abyss in the first place is obviously crucial, and the good news is that prevention is possible. Experts already know a lot about both why and how people get radicalized, but the difficult part is interrupting the process by which vulnerable people are exposed to ever more vicious propaganda that lures them into the darkest caverns of social media. One of the most promising avenues for prevention has emerged from a surprising place: parents and schools who have made it a mission to battle social media addiction. They're using the same tools that proved so effective at curtailing a different and even deadlier public health menace, cigarette smoking. Oh, interesting. Only this time around, instead of suing Philip Morris and other big tobacco companies, they're going after Meta, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and Snapchat. Another QAnon Casualties poster who goes by Tristan Penifel, also not his real name, told me that Anne's story is highly typical of visitors in the forum. People show up initially, he said, wondering how they can debunk the wild stories and outrageous claims they're hearing from formerly normal loved ones. Tristan says he and the other forum regulars gently try to steer the newbies away from that path. The old hands know that it's nearly impossible to argue people out of false beliefs that they've picked up online once those have become ingrained in their identity. Tristan told me his father fell deep into the realm of right-wing conspiracy theory years ago, and he became obsessed with the claim that Barack Obama had been born in Kenya. I spent hours one evening debunking every single thing that he could find about the birth certificate being fake, Tristan explained in a Zoom interview. By the end of all of that, he was like, okay, maybe the birth certificate is real. But Tristan's victory was short-lived. His father immediately pivoted to another conspiracy theory that claimed Obama was handpicked by the banks to protect them after the 2008 financial crisis. Tristan's father had once been involved in Occupy Wall Street, but the allure of online conspiracy theories had pulled him far to the right. Tristan went on to write about his experiences at Medium, arguing that all of this is ultimately on the conspiracy theorist. They are the ones who have some kind of emotional sickness driving them into these beliefs, and they are the ones who can cure themselves. If they refuse to engage, no one else can save them. None of this comes as a surprise to experts who research far-right groups and conspiracy theorists. What the members of QAnon Casualties see happening to their loved ones is much bigger and more systematic than a small subset of the population adopting some kooky notions. Instead, they have become radicalized, and recent history tells us that while most people who believe outlandish conspiracy theories will not commit violent acts, the danger is very real. Even when they don't commit violence, people who get involved in these movements destroy their lives. Dave Nywert, author of The Age of Insurrection, The Radical Right's Assault on American Democracy, told me in a recent interview. It draws people into the abyss. It ruins their family relationships, ruins their relationships in the community. Early in the Trump administration, activists like Christian Piccolini, who has worked to help de-radicalize white nationalists, attracted a flurry of media attention. Most experts believe, however, that convincing someone who has dug themselves deep down the rabbit hole is a difficult and unpredictable process. Speaking of, this is making me think of the other preventive activities undertaken in Finland, teaching kids social media literacy, more so than breaking addiction cycles. But okay, we'll see if that gets a mention in here at some point. De-radicalization is even more personal and idiosyncratic than radicalization. Brian Hughes, an American university professor who co-founded the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, that acronym comes out to PERIL, by the way. Not too bad, really. De-radicalization is something that you do after the worst has already happened, he continued, meaning after a person has really made a grave social or even moral mistake, or sometimes committed an act of violence. Even at that point, it frequently doesn't stick. Even as defendants from the January 6th Capitol attack face prison sentences, there's a common thread to many of their stories. They're totally not sorry. Jacob Chansley, the infamous QAnon shaman, got some relatively sympathetic media coverage after his arrest when his defense attorney portrayed him as a regretful dupe. Now that he's out of jail, however, Chansley has made clear that he's still a member of the QAnon faithful. Yikes. Chansley told the Arizona Mirror he was, quote, not a big fan of his now former lawyer. After I found out all the things he was saying in the media about without my consent, he said that I felt duped by Trump. I never said that. I never asked him to say that. He said that I denounced Q and the QAnon community. I never said that. Uh-oh. Lock him back up. Lisa Sugira of the University of Portsmouth encountered a similar phenomenon. She said, while researching her book, The Incel Rebellion, oh my goodness, the rise of the manosphere and the virtual war against women. I forgot to mention the possible influence of incel along with men's rights wackadoodles when Ron DeSantis foolishly signed this anti-alimony bill. I didn't make mention of that. Anyway, while some men she interviewed identified as former rather than present tense incels, Segura reports that many still share the same misogynistic views found on the involuntarily celibate forums that they had supposedly left behind. They will still say, oh, well, women still get away with we're going to have to give ourselves the Donald Trump pass on saying women still get away with a pussy pass, or that women shouldn't be so picky, she said. It's very depressing. You think, well, is there a way out? There is no getting him back. He is very much dead to me, said George Fincher, who lives in Birmingham, England, and agreed to use his real name. He was talking about his stepfather, a former Royal Marine who has gone deep down the online QAnon rabbit hole. Fincher said he suspects that his stepfather is battling unresolved trauma and, in the process, has alienated his family. He doesn't speak to his kids. He's met his grandchild once, Fincher explained. Probably, in his mind, the only thing that he has going for him is this QAnon idolatry, because he certainly doesn't have a family anymore. This comports with what researchers know about people who become radicalized. PERIL uses a supply and demand model to explain the process. Hughes laid out his theory in a legal brief filed in a lawsuit after Stephen Carrillo, an Air Force sergeant affiliated with the extremely online Boogaloo movement, shot 3 law enforcement officers in California, killing one of them. On one hand, extremist recruiters and propagandists offer a supply of ideological material, imagery, entertainment, and opportunities to organize with like-minded extremists, Hughes wrote. On the other hand, individuals pursue radicalization because it meets certain social and psychological needs. This is the demand side of radicalization. As Hughes told Salon in an interview, in the days before the internet, a person would have to be very lucky, or very unlucky, depending on how you want to look at it, to encounter extremist propaganda or an extremist recruiter. Neo-Nazis used to trawl hardcore punk clubs looking for vulnerable kids. White nationalists would look for prospects to target at gun shows. What's changed nowadays with the internet, he said, is that you can't avoid radicalizing material. Propaganda is everywhere. Evidence that the internet has accelerated radicalization is also everywhere, as anyone who has watched Facebook friends melt down in real time can attest. Researchers at the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, one of Greg's favorites, found in 2022 that nearly 1 in 5 Americans, 16%, are QAnon believers. Among Republicans, that proportion rose to 25%. Beyond the damage done to individuals, families, and the body politic, there is compelling evidence that online radicalization has fueled a rapid rise in extremist violence. The Government Accountability Office reported a nearly fourfold rise in domestic terrorism cases from 2013 to 2021. In many of the most dramatic examples, a common factor is online radicalization. Consider incel killer Elliot Rodger in California, white supremacist mass murderer Dylan Roof in South Carolina, and the mass shootings in a Pittsburgh synagogue, an El Paso Walmart, and a Buffalo supermarket. These dreadful cases are alarmingly similar. A young man, radicalized by online propaganda, decided to act on his bigoted delusions with real-world violence. Now, a new section entitled A Facebook Whistleblower Opens the Door. In the fall of 2021, former Facebook employee Frances Haugen, maybe Haugen, began to release reams of internal company documents, not the Twitter files, but the Facebook files, I guess, exposing all manner of embarrassing secrets. Facebook had knowingly let disinformation flourish on its platform, had turned a blind eye to hate speech and overt incitements to violence, and deliberately targeted underage users, despite internal research showing that social media overuse could be dangerous to minors. So it really does start to look like the tobacco cases in this sense, doesn't it? There were conflicts of interest between what was good for the public and what was good for Facebook, Haugen told 60 Minutes. Facebook, over and over again, chose to optimize for its own interests, like making more money. The Facebook document dump was a big scandal, at least at first, but media attention faded rapidly, especially as Elon Musk flirted with buying Twitter and then finally did so, shifting the locus of concern over social media disinformation away from Facebook and toward the Bird site. But Haugen's whistleblowing clearly had an impact on government and the legal system in terms of one crucial issue, the mental health impacts of social media algorithms on teenagers and children. Over the past year and a half, there have been multiple congressional hearings about the health risks of social media for underage users. A Center for Disease Control report on the teen mental health crisis included concerns about the impacts of social media. In May, Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy released an advisory noting, quote, growing evidence that social media use is associated with harm to young people's mental health. While admitting that the phenomenon is complex and that social media access can be beneficial for some kids in some circumstances, he argued that unregulated excessive use was a likely contributing factor to the national youth mental health crisis. What mental health risks are we talking about here? This remains a fraught topic, where research is continuing. What's discussed most often are issues like low self-esteem, suicidal ideation, eating disorders, insomnia, and attention disorders. But there is also evidence that the potentially addictive qualities of social media, although the term addictive remains controversial, contribute to right-wing radicalization. So one way of framing the problem and a potential solution is to argue that if social media companies can be forced to curtail the business strategies that lead users down right-wing rabbit holes and negatively affect mental health, it would be much more difficult for far-right movements to recruit online. legislative approaches to regulating social media are still in their infancy. And even before I get on to this, I'm reading that out loud. And as much as you and I probably think that's a great idea, think about what they think about this in Republican circles. The idea that you would deliberately legislate against business strategies that would lead users to become right-wing. I mean, we understand that as, yeah, it's like actually helping people avoid mental illness. On their side, they are, of course, saying, see, we told you that big tech had an anti-Republican bias. This is all about attacking us because we're Republicans, as opposed to saying, well, the real problem is that Republicans or right-leaning organizations teach people to lean into their mental illness and make themselves worse. But of course, the right-wing websites are rife with comments and supposed proofs that liberalism is a mental disease. So, we're all going to have to take all of this with a certain grain of salt. Anyway, back to the story here. Let's see, legislative approaches are still in their infancy, yes, and are likely to encounter strong resistance of the sort I just told you about among them, I would guess. But there's one promising channel that could move a lot faster: litigation. A growing number of lawsuits filed by school districts, parents, and young people themselves are claiming that social media companies deliberately design their products to be addictive, or at least to draw in users for longer periods of time and maximize, quote, engagement, which is contributing to the youth mental health crisis. The end goal is to make young people engage with and stay on the platforms as long as possible, because that means they can sell more advertising. Lawyers for the Cabrillo Unified School District in Northern California argue in a district court lawsuit filed in May. The YouTube, TikTok, Snap, and Meta companies have learned that this is best accomplished by catering an endless flow of the lowest common denominator of content that is most provocative and toxic that they can get away with. And yes, by the way, I don't know, Californians, you tell me, is it Cabrillo Unified School District, or do you anglicize it and make it Cabrillo? Maybe one day we'll find out. Ann Murphy, one of the plaintiff's lead attorneys, told Salon, there's been good research done that shows that social media's effect on the brain is very similar to the effects that you have with gambling or even taking recreational drugs. What we are looking at is the public nuisance legal theory, which allows government entities to hold companies liable for unique damages caused as a result of a company's conduct, said Ron Repak, a lawyer who is representing Pittsburgh area schools in a similar lawsuit. The lawyers who spoke to Salon pointed to precedent-setting lawsuits of years past based on claims that companies had deliberately addicted their customers to harmful products in search of greater profitability. The most famous of these were the consumer protection cases against tobacco companies that began in the 1990s, which were so successful the federal government joined in. In 1999, the Department of Justice won a racketeering suit against Philip Morris and the other tobacco companies, successfully claiming those huge corporations had systematically defrauded the public by lying about the health risks of smoking. Now the school districts suing social media companies are making similar claims, also from a position of governmental authority. Similar lawsuits are being filed by parents who allege direct damages to their children. Listen to parents. Parents' rights. Get out of the way, Republicans. This is your baby. I doubt that'll work with the Gimmitarians, but we could always throw it out there. The lawyers who spoke to Salon emphasized that their goal is not strictly financial, although their claims are partly based on the taxpayer money lost because schools must spend more on mental health and security. Where have we heard that before? They also hope that a measure of real accountability can force social media companies to rethink how they do business. Ira Weiss, who represents a different Pittsburgh area school district, said he believes that these kinds of lawsuits against the tobacco giants, big pharma, and vape manufacturers, for instance, can also help educate the public and political leaders. During the discovery process, Weiss explained, internal company documents will likely be obtained, and there will be depositions taken where all this marketing and technology strategy will become known. One recent model that made headlines was the defamation suit against Fox News by Dominion Voting Systems, which exposed a great deal of embarrassing material about the right-wing cable network's internal operations. That's just the way it is with Discovery in general. Anyway, or at least that's the hope in the juiciest cases. Theories about exactly how social media addicts people or lures them in deeper, especially younger people, are still being developed. It's fair to say the mechanism is not exactly understood, as was also true of nicotine addiction for many years. But there can be little doubt that social media companies program their algorithms to make scrolling seem almost irresistible. As Haugen put it, Facebook's internal research made clear that its products were, quote, designed to be engaging, and also that, quote, that can lead to very high rates of what we call problematic use. Ooh, they even call it that, huh? Okay. As an article for NBC's Today site explains it, that's how an innocent search for healthy recipes on Instagram might lead a teenager to eating disorder content instead. That's what is meant by the ubiquitous term rabbit hole. Users may begin with relatively innocuous content, but to keep them engaged, social media algorithms keep serving up ever more extreme and yet more engaging content that can plant dark thoughts and provoke deep insecurities. One lawsuit filed by California parents cites Pew Research showing that for some users, the more they use social media, the more they are drawn down the rabbit hole into further use, making it increasingly difficult for them to stop. Next new section here, addicted, quote unquote, addicted to QAnon, misogyny, and the boogaloo. The same rabbit hole phenomenon that can draw social media users deeper into the world of eating disorders or suicidal ideation also appears to be a factor in online radicalization. Lisa Segura notes that many of the men she interviewed while researching the incel community were first drawn into that world through unrelated or apolitical online material before the algorithm turned their heads toward darker stuff. One interviewee, she said, had done a simple Google search about male pattern baldness and eventually ended up on incel forums, which were heavily dissecting and debating whether being bald is an incel trait. That man became an incel very much through the algorithm, Segura said, and through online conversations with people who, quote, showed him a different way to view the world. Pathologies like eating disorders and suicidality exist on a continuum with radicalization, said Brian Hughes, the American University scholar. In a lot of cases, they're comorbid. Depression and radicalization are commonly seen together. Just as online merchants hawking dangerous diet products exploit young women's insecurities, he added, the world of far-right influencers displays an obsession with an idealized masculine physique, which often leads to steroid abuse. The most famous example of that phenomenon, Andrew Tate, a British influencer currently being held by Romanian authorities on charges of rape and human trafficking. Tate's alleged victims say he choked them until they passed out, beat them with a belt, and threatened them with a gun. A former kickboxer, Tate has made a fortune by showing off his muscular physique and expensive toys, gizmos, and gear to attract a massive online following of young men, promising that he can turn them into alpha males. Tate has become so popular with boys and young men in the English-speaking world that educators are organizing and sharing resources in an effort to combat his influence. There's been a huge increase in rape jokes that the boys are making, a 7th grade teacher in Hawaii told Education Week. Conspiracy theories and right-wing propaganda often hook people, as Tate does, by appealing to anxiety and insecurity, especially regarding hot-button issues like race, gender, and status. In his legal brief in the case of Stephen Carrillo, Hughes explained that the murderer was gratified by the feelings of anger and indignation from far-right videos that he saw on Facebook and was rewarded with more extreme, more angering content. Carrillo pleaded guilty to murder and 8 other felony charges last year and is serving a life sentence without parole. Facebook algorithms would encourage Carrillo to join a Facebook group called California Commando, in both cases spelled with a K. Hughes wrote, "Once there, his deterioration increased at a terrific speed. He fully embraced the new identity of Boogaloo Revolutionary." Jason Van Tatenhove, if I've pronounced that correctly, understands how that process works. A former member of the Oath Keepers, he offered dramatic testimony before the House January 6th committee last year, explaining how leaders convinced their followers to join the insurrection on Trump's behalf. In his book, The Perils of Extremism, How I Left the Oath Keepers and Why We Should Be Concerned About a Future Civil War, Van Tatenhove details how he first got sucked into the group and what it took for him to get out. "There's kind of a formula to what we're doing," said Van Tatenhove, who was hired to do communications work by Oath Keepers leader Stuart Rhodes, who was recently himself convicted of seditious conspiracy and other charges and sentenced to 18 years in prison. "We were always watching the news aggregates. We would set up Google alerts on certain keywords in order to tailor recruitment content to what potential prospects were seeking out, especially on social media. What were the issues that really got people outraged and angry? Because that's the low-hanging fruit," Van Tatenhove added. "We were looking for that outrage and that anger because it seems to short-circuit our critical thinking centers. That's exactly the kind of content that Facebook's algorithms have favored, according to Frances Haugen. When you give more distribution to content that can get reactions," she said in a recent MSNBC interview, "you end up rewarding more extreme content because the shortest path to like is anger." That being, of course, the like button sort of thing on Facebook. Van Tatenhove said he is personally in recovery from drug addiction and, during our conversation, compared the allure of conspiracy theories to that of heroin. "While heroin feels great, it ruins your life," he said. "While conspiracy theories feel great and we get all those chemical releases, much like shooting heroin, it's damaging to our country and it's damaging to our democracy." He suggested that the U.S. needs an analog to methadone for our conspiracy theory addiction. What is to be done? The next section. There's clearly no magic bullet solution to this problem, but the growing number of lawsuits by parents and schools could be the beginning of one. None of these plaintiffs seek a cold turkey approach to social media, which would neither be possible nor desirable. As Murthy told the Offline podcast, it's clear that many people find community on social media that they might not find elsewhere, and that was doubly true during the pandemic. Social media, he added, can be especially beneficial for those from a historically marginalized group where it's difficult to find people who may be going through similar experiences, such as LGBTQ youth. As the complaint in the California parents' lawsuit argues, the issue is not the existence of social media, but the company's reliance on an algorithmically generated endless feed to keep users scrolling in an induced flow state. Intermittent variable rewards that manipulate dopamine delivery to intensify use. Trophies to reward extreme usage, and other features to keep people overstimulated and unable or unwilling to log off. The desired outcome here is simple. Perhaps the financial threats from these lawsuits will induce social media companies to make their products less addictive. Haugen has repeatedly argued that the path forward will require some form of government regulation, but the two approaches aren't separate but intertwined. The lawyers who spoke to Salon emphasized they believe their lawsuits can generate public attention and information that will help shape both future regulation and the public will to enact it. The most promising legislative effort is a bipartisan bill, introduced by Senator Brian Schatz, good guy, of course, Democrat of Hawaii, in case you didn't know, and co-sponsored by another liberal Democrat, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, and two conservative Republicans, Katie Britt of Alabama and Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Blah. The Protecting Kids on Social Media Act, like a similar state law in Utah, would bar kids under 13 from starting social media accounts and require parental consent for older teenagers. That is almost certainly unenforceable, but more intriguingly, the bill also takes aim at online algorithms, barring companies from using them to drive content to minors, although it would remain legal to use them on adults. Just as I was reading this, I was having this thought that it might be wise to ride the artificial intelligence wave of fear in this. The algorithm really kind of is like a modified form of artificial intelligence trying to decide for you without any human intervention what to serve you to make you angrier and angrier. And I guess as we, as legislators, I don't know, with good basis or without, lots of legislators are turning to the idea of reining in the use of artificial intelligence, and they might as well throw these algorithms in there too until courts start shooting it down. I mean, they're really going to have to think through the basis of their legislative direction and what their authority would be for intervening, perhaps. But as long as they're frightened about AI, they might as well be encouraged to throw the algorithms in, lump them in together, conflate the two. I'm saying do it on purpose. Yes, that's fine. I don't know. We may see that happen yet. Anyway, back to the article here. While kids are suffering, social media companies are profiting, Schatz said in a statement. Our bill will help us stop the growing social media health crisis among kids by setting a minimum age and preventing companies from using algorithms to automatically feed them addictive content based on their personal information. Of course, as the families of QAnon believers and the victims of right-wing extremist violence can attest, it's not just kids who are going down dangerous online rabbit holes. Schatz conceded as much in a Wired interview, saying, "It's bad enough that it's happening to all of us adults, but that the least we can do is protect our kids." The fate of that bill is uncertain, and there's considerable resistance in both parties to pursuing direct federal regulation of social media, which would surely be cast by the social media industry and some civil liberties advocates as an attack on First Amendment rights. Schatz has argued, however, that there is no free speech right to be jammed with an algorithm. Restricting, my mind goes to redistricting, but restricting the use of algorithms wouldn't impact anyone's constitutional right to express their opinions on social media. It would simply prevent the companies from shoving the most incendiary content at the most vulnerable users. It's a good point, too. These questions of free speech and social media algorithms are tricky, and the legal and legislative arguments are in their early stages. When the Supreme Court was confronted earlier this year with a case arguing that social media companies should be liable for algorithmic promotion of pro-terrorist content, the justices seemed grateful to punt the entire issue. Legal experts hope that the consumer protection argument driving this new wave of social media lawsuits will create a framework for addressing this issue that sidesteps First Amendment concerns. The recent Supreme Court case looked at whether a company can be held accountable for specific content. Attorney Ann Murphy said, "We're looking at it much more holistically by considering whether the algorithm should exist in its current form at all, considering the demonstrable harm it does to children. The core idea here is to shift the focus from individual speech, which everyone agrees is protected by the Constitution, to the larger question of regulating the social media business model to mitigate its effects on public health. If the legal groundwork can be laid in these cases on the principle that children and teenagers should be protected from predatory business practices and deliberately harmful products, that could open the door to a larger regulatory structure that makes the internet safer for everyone. This entire discussion is still in its infancy, and more needs to be learned about the way social media affects mental health. As mentioned above, there's considerable debate over whether the addiction model is a fair or accurate way to describe what happens when people get sucked deep into online rabbit hole communities that encourage destructive behavior or ideologies. As the lawyers who spoke to Salon almost universally expressed, they hope this litigation can help illuminate some of these issues and drive more resources toward the necessary research. Still, the family members of right-wing conspiracy believers have little doubt that social media had a profoundly debilitating effect on their loved ones. In many cases, people who were vulnerable to the algorithm-driven pressure to stay online. Some people who dive down the rabbit hole may be struggling with long-term trauma or undiagnosed mental illness. Many are extremely lonely. In some cases, they have pre-existing prejudices and are eager to have their bigoted views validated by disinformation. Whatever the root causes may be, social media platforms are profiting handsomely off people who are slowly losing their minds to the reality distortion field in their feeds. No one suggests these lawsuits can solve the problem by themselves, but they could mark the beginning of a major public reckoning with the harms of social media that leads eventually to real answers. That's a really good article and some really good food for thought. I wonder whether we'll see any progress in that. Brian Schatz, I hope, will stay on the case. Chris Murphy as well. They could lose Tom Cotton as far as I'm concerned, but I guess that buys them some bipartisan credibility for whatever that's worth these days. But really interesting, and a real interesting modeling, borrowing from the tobacco cases there. You can really see your way to a public health issue decision, sidestepping the First Amendment issues. And also a good point made along the way. It's not restricting anybody's ability to express themselves, but it restricts how much others or what others can express to you as dictated by a non-person. Are there free speech rights really for algorithms? I don't know that we should stretch the concept that far, and hopefully we can head that one off at the pass. I mean, I guess we're almost there anyway with certain Republicans declaring that corporations are people. Well, algorithms certainly aren't, and that's why I say they might want to capitalize on the artificial intelligence craze at the moment. Now that that's got everyone panicked, you might as well draw the line at algorithms too. All right, lots to think about. Good inclusion, I hope. All right.
Good morning, David.
Yes, you said that already. Good morning.
Today I'd like to bring you up to date on what the MAGA extremists are doing in Ottawa County. You may remember that a slate of radical Republicans got together, named their group Ottawa Impact, and then bounced the more normal GOP incumbents off the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners last November. They changed the county's slogan, fired the professional county administrator, and tried to fire the county's public health officer, who made people wear masks during a pandemic. The guy they hired to replace the professional administrator was John Gibbs, a Trump toady whose claim to fame was working as an acting deputy administrator in HUD. He also ran for Secretary of State in 2020, thankfully losing to incumbent Jocelyn Benson. During that campaign, someone unearthed old blogs where Gibbs said that women shouldn't have the right to vote. Gibbs is now in charge of Ottawa County staff and had to get special budget approval to hire an assistant and a bigger communications department to help him do the job. Gibbs also works directly with the Board of Commissioners. That's where problems started. According to Commissioner Jacob Bonema, also a Republican, Gibbs didn't respond to Bonema's texts and emails. When Bonema confronted Gibbs about the lack of communications for 2 weeks on the hot topic of the county health officer, Gibbs said to Bonema, quote, "Get out of my face, dude," unquote. Then Bonema filed a disciplinary complaint with the county HR department alleging Gibbs's threatening behavior. Fast forward, and now Bonema is in the hot seat, as the Ottawa Impact members voted to censor him. Recently, the Ottawa County Chair, Joe Moss, introduced a resolution that Bonema's unfounded harassment complaint against Gibbs represented an abuse of power. The resolution passed, and Bonema was removed as vice chair of the Finance and Administration Committee. This follows a similar action by the county GOP that censored Bonema for behavior, quote, unbecoming of a public servant, unquote, and for, quote, violating Republican values, unquote. This happened at the same meeting that the county board passed a resolution titled Protecting Childhood Innocence, that forbids county resources and staff from participating in events, content, or institutions which, quote, support, normalize, or encourage the sexualization of children and youth, unquote. This comes after the county health department set up a booth during Grand Haven's Pride Festival and Holland's Pride Festival, where they distributed monkeypox vaccines and information about sexually transmitted diseases. The move concerned some county commissioners during their June 13th meeting, saying that the health department's presence could be seen as an endorsement for what they called, quote, risky behavior, unquote. These resolutions were under the leadership of County Chair Joe Moss, who, strangely, happened to also show up in an amicus brief before the U.S. Supreme Court about a web design company having to create pages for a same-sex couple. Moss and his business partner, Joel Coleman, are web designers and created together a company called Eclarion LLC and are signed on to the amicus brief. In the document, the two do not formally take a position on a ruling, but argue, quote, custom websites and graphics are expressive works of art which reflect the voice of their creators, unquote. Moss, however, has never hid his stance and celebrated the ruling on social media. I'll keep updating your listeners on the future mayhem that Moss will continue to create for the residents of Ottawa County and the state of Michigan. That's my time for today. This is Rosalyn MacGregor signing off. Back to you, David.
Ooh, you know what? I should have done something for when Rosalyn says she's signing off. On the first one, she's not really signing off. She's just taking a break. But this time she actually is signing off. Let's wrap it up then with one more segment before departing from our shortened 1-hour vacation special. Here is an interesting guest essay in the New York Times from Radley Balco, which has a, relatively, I guess, surprising headline. Half the police force quit, crime dropped. It's not all that surprising to Radley Balco fans, probably, but let him explain exactly what's going on here. The piece begins this way. In a staggering report last month, the Department of Justice documented pervasive abuse, illegal use of force, racial bias, and systemic dysfunction in the Minneapolis Police Department. City police officers engaged in brutality or made racist comments, even as a department investigator rode along in a patrol car. I guess there's just no stopping these guys. Complaints about police abuse were often slow-walked or dismissed without investigation, and after George Floyd's death, instead of ending the police, the policy of racial profiling, the police just buried the evidence. The Minneapolis report was shocking, but it wasn't surprising. It doesn't read much differently from recent Justice Department reports about the police departments in Chicago, Baltimore, Cleveland, Albuquerque, New Orleans, Ferguson, Missouri, or any of the 3 recent reports from various sources about Minneapolis from 2003, 2015, and 2016. Amid spiking nationwide homicide rates in 2020 and 2021, and a continuing shortage of police officers, many in law enforcement have pointed to investigations like these, along with defund the police style activism, as the problem. With all the criticism they are weathering, the argument goes, officers are so hemmed in, they can no longer do their job right. Not that they were doing it right before, but anyway, eventually they quit, defeated and demoralized. Fewer police officers, more crime. Lying just below the surface of that characterization is a starkly cynical message to marginalized communities. You can have accountable and constitutional policing, or you can have safety. But you can't have both. In accord with that view, some academic studies have found that more police officers can correlate with less crime, but the studies don't account for factors that the Minneapolis report highlights. The social costs of police brutality and misconduct, how they can erode public trust, how that erosion of trust affects public safety, and they don't account for the potential benefits of less coercive, less confrontational alternatives to the police. We don't have as many studies that take those factors into account, but to see the effects in real time, you need only step over the Minneapolis city line. Golden Valley is a suburb of about 22,000 that in many ways is as idyllic as the name suggests. The median household income tops $100,000. There's very little crime, and 15% of the town is devoted to parks and green spaces, including Theodore Wirth Park on its eastern border, a lush space that hosts a bike path and a parkway. But the town's Elysian charm comes with a dark past. Just on the other side of the park lies the neighborhood of Willard Hay. There, the median household income drops to about $55,000 per year, and there's quite a bit more crime. Willard Hay is 26% white and 40% black. Golden Valley is 85% white and 5% black, the result of pervasive racial covenants. We enjoy prosperity and security in this community, said Shep Harris, the mayor since 2012, but that has come at a cost. I think it took incidents like the murder of George Floyd to help us see that more clearly. The residents of the strongly left-leaning town decided change was necessary. One step was eliminating those racial covenants. Another was changing the police department, which had a reputation for mistreating people of color. The first hire was Officer Alice White, the force's first high-ranking black woman. The second was Virgil Green, the town's first black police chief. When I started, black folks I'd speak to in Minneapolis seemed surprised that I'd been hired, Chief Green said when I spoke with him recently. They told me they and most people they knew avoided driving through Golden Valley. Members of the overwhelmingly white police force responded to both hires by quitting in droves. An outside investigation later revealed that some officers had run an opposition campaign against Chief Green. One of those officers recorded herself making a series of racist comments during a call with city officials and then sent the recording to other police officers. She was fired, prompting yet another wave of resignations. The typical Golden Valley police officer makes a six-figure salary with good benefits. The city has almost no violent crime. It's a good gig. Yet in just 2 years, more than half the department quit. I haven't been on the job long enough to make any significant changes, Chief Green said. Yet we're losing officers left and right. It's hard not to think that they just don't want to work under a black supervisor. The interesting thing is that according to Chief Green, despite the reduction in staff, crime, already low, has gone down in Golden Valley. The town plans to staff the department back up, just not right away. I've heard that the police union is cautioning officers from coming to work here, Mr. Harris said, but that's okay. We want to take the time to hire officers who share our vision and are excited to work toward our goals. Mr. Harris is quick to point out that Golden Valley may not be the perfect model for the rest of the country. This is a wealthy community with very little crime, he said. We can afford to go through this change. I realize that may not be the case in other places. There is reason to think it may. When New York's officers engaged in an announced slowdown in policing in late 2014 and early 2015, civilian complaints of major crime in the city dropped. And despite significant staffing shortages at law enforcement agencies around the country, if trends continue, 2023 will have the largest percentage drop in homicides in U.S. history. It's true that such a drop would come after a 2-year surge, but the fact that it would also occur after a significant reduction in law enforcement personnel suggests the surge may have been due more to the pandemic and its effects than depolicing. At the very least, the steady stream of Justice Department reports depicting rampant police abuse ought to temper the claim that policing shortages are fueling crime. It's no coincidence that the cities we most associate with violence also have long and documented histories of police abuse. When people don't trust law enforcement, they stop cooperating and resolve disputes in other ways. Instead of fighting to retain police officers who feel threatened by accountability and perpetuate that distrust, cities might consider just letting them leave. Pretty interesting. Not, he doesn't make it out to be conclusive evidence of one and only one thesis here, but it's an interesting one, given how adamant police and police advocates were about exactly what would happen, undoubtedly, to crime were they all to leave. Well, interesting to have a counterexample, and of course, interesting to have Radley Balco be the one that finds it.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Okay, that wraps up our Wednesday. We'll be back on Friday with one more all-new one-hour show. Tomorrow, Thursday, well, put on your prognostication caps and think about what I will be playing for a rerun. And when you figure it out, let me know so I can select the appropriate tape. Time travel, KITM style.